Hello out there. I'm just trying to share my experiences of I was doing a refresh memory on CodePipeline and CodeDeploy. It had been a little bit of time since I worked with that, and it's all coming back to me again. There's a really good tutorial out there on Amazon's website. Basically, it's called Creating a Four-Stage Pipeline. And ultimately, what they end up doing is using Jenkins as a build step, by in which Jenkins will pull from your GitHub repository, and then it'll go ahead and push the output of the Jenkins build step as input to AWS CodeDeploy, which is going to go ahead and push the artifacts and the actual site over to a test instance. And basically, what will happen is after that, you'll get an approval request, which allows you to review it. And if you approve of it, it'll go ahead and deploy the application to a production instance. And what I mean by that, here I basically have three EC2 instances. So I have EC2 instance, which is my CodeDeploy test instance. And then I have a CodeDeploy production instance, and then I got my Jenkins pipeline test. And that's an EC2 instance, which I've provisioned, and it basically is hosting Jenkins here. So you can see this IP address right here, 394.201.55. Basically, that is what you see down here. So I'm actually logged into Jenkins. So let me just kind of show you. This will make a little bit of sense. This is not intended to be a tutorial here. Ultimately, you know, I'm hoping that you'll go through the steps in this particular tutorial. So I'm just kind of showing you a summary in which you can expect and things of that nature. But I'm kind of working backwards here because it makes kind of sense. But here's CodePipeline. And so AWS basically provides CodeDeploy and CodePipeline as a part of your CI/CD continuous integration. And the idea is CodeDeploy is an AWS service by in which you have a CodeDeploy agent installed on your EC2 instance. And basically that is going to be monitoring deployment requests that are coming from AWS. And the ultimate idea there is whenever the agent is notified of a new push to that instance, it's going to go ahead and pull the artifacts from an S3 bucket, and it's going to deploy that onto your machine. And so if you take a look here, what I've got and what you'll do if you go through the tutorial for the most part is I have a pipeline that has several different stages here. And basically what's happening is it's pulling all of the changes from a GitHub repo. And if you take a look at the repo right here, it's going to my master branch, and basically you know, here's the repo. So it'll be watching the repo for any changes anytime you push something up there. You know, this is the first step in the process, is to pull the changes from that. And then the second one, the second stage, if you will, is going to cause Jenkins to, when it gets notified, you know, of pulling these changes to the EC2 instance itself, Jenkins will be notified. And basically, if we take a look at this given stage, and this is an action inside of there, you can see this given action is pointing to a project called Jenkins Pipeline. And if I go to my Jenkins, you'll see that I have, this is basically a new, if you do a configure, here's your Jenkins project pipeline. And if we take a look at that, let's go into the configuration. It is basically a process by which it's going to take its information from CodePipeline. So here's the build step right here. And it is going to actually run the rake command. So it's actually going to run the rake command on the EC2 instance that's hosting Jenkins. And when it's done doing the rake, and you'll see it's all a part of the tutorial, but when it's done doing the rake command, it's going to go ahead and push the output of that and publish it back to your code pipeline publisher, which ends up causing it to proceed to the very next stage, which is now it's time to deploy the doggone thing. So taking a look at Jenkins here, so what's going to happen is it's going to basically pull every minute for changes right here. Just so this is kind of like a cron job setup deal right here. And we are using a couple of plugins. So we're using, we have a rake plugin installed for Jenkins, and we also have the CodePipeline plugin installed for Jenkins. So if we go ahead and take a look at that, and if we go back to here, Jenkins, we can go to Manage Jenkins, take a look at your plugins. You can see what we have installed. So for this tutorial, we had to install this guy right here, the CodePipeline one, and we also had to install the rake plugin right here too. So it just basically allows you to execute rake from within Jenkins, and then the CodePipeline plugin basically allows Jenkins to communicate back and forth to CodePipeline. And again, how that's done is you give it the, if we take a look at the pipeline right here, or the project, and we take a look at this, it basically happens when we are using the publish plugin. So we're actually running the build step right here for the, let's see right there, for the category. So that's our build step. But anyways, when it's done, it's going to publish it back to CodePipeline. So after that, it's going to go ahead and deploy that particular application to our test deployment group, and that is basically CodeDeploy. But if you take a look at your EC2 console, there's two instances that both have the CodeDeploy agent installed in them. So here's our test instance, and it's got its own IP address. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, because I've already run this a few times, and I'll go ahead and show you in a little bit more detail about this. But if we go ahead and just run index.html, here's the actual application that got deployed over to our test instance. And that's what you've got going on here. And then what happens is after it's deployed to your test instance, which is kind of cool, we actually have a manual approval step within CodePipeline, and it's just yet another action that you can do right here. So, you know, it's basically, let's take a look at this. What happens is we've got this wired up. Let me just do an edit. We've got the manual approval step wired up to basically trigger an SNS notification, which sends an email to your email address saying, hey, you know, there's an action waiting for your approval. Please go ahead and approve it. So here's the approval action. The provider itself is manual approval, and if you can see, there's many different types of providers for these, and builds and sources. But in this case, we got the manual approval one. Here's my SNS topic, and basically this points to my email address. This particular URL for review gets sent into your email, you know, saying, hey, please review this particular URL, and then any other optional comments that you want to have sent to you in email. And so basically the pipeline is going to suspend until you approve of it. Once you approve of it, if you rejected it, the pipeline ends right there. But once you approve it, then it's going to proceed to the next step, which is going to be to deploy the application over to your production instance. So taking a look at our CodeDeploy, we have a couple of deployments that I have set up. We have a test application and a production application. And as a part of the CodeDeploy, you actually have to set up deployment groups. And, you know, correspondingly, I have a test deployment group set up as well as a production deployment group. And the deployment group is kind of now, it's similar to target groups when it comes to EC2 load balancing, where you specify your target instances and stuff to include. But your deployment group basically is where you specify certain criteria for your deployment itself. So as a part of the deployment group here, you can say, hey, which instances do I actually want to deploy the application to? You know, and which role do I want to run it to? You can do blue-green as well. If you look here, again, you can add the option to do EC2 auto scaling groups. But if you look here, I'm saying deploy. This deployment group is going to send all of its deployments to EC2 instances. It doesn't have to be just one. It could be more than one, as long as they got the tag name set up here. So I have a tag name called CodeDeploy test instance, and that name has to match the tag name that you set up when you run your EC2 instance, or when you launch it, I should say. So, so that just basically means it's targeting this particular instance for this right here. And then you have different deployment settings. So again, if you're doing blue-green, or if you have multiple instances, you can specify, do it all at once, one at a time, half at a time, things of that nature. Optional part here is pretty cool because I've actually got triggers set up. A trigger just basically says, hey, anytime a deployment occurred, these are the events. When these events occur, go ahead and send a notification to this trigger. And basically, it's an SNS trigger that points to my emails, so I'll get emails, but you can specify SNS to go to other particular destinations as well. So not just email. So I get emails whenever I run a deployment right here. So that's basically the gist of deployment groups. So I got a test application and a test deployment group, as well as a production application and a production deployment group. So another kind of cool thing that you can see is through your logs right here, you can see all of the individual deployments that have occurred. You know, so you can take a look at this given deployment, and then you could take a look at the events, so you can see all of the different stages that occurred. You know, the code, shall we say, the code deploy hooks in the life cycle, like the before install. So you could specify with your code deploy agents various things that you want to do on your EC2 instance before the install happens, while it's happening, after it installs, and then when the application is about to start, and then when the service is starting. So it allows you to customize and run different things, you know, where you could set up encryption, install certificates, all kinds of various things. So I won't actually SSH into these instances, but I will say that when you launch these instances, you will have a startup script that basically runs when you install. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. Okay, so basically when I launch the instances for the CodeDeploy ones, you go ahead and put this in your advanced settings area, so it'll actually go ahead and run this upon startup. And the key thing right here is you're installing the AWS CLI on the instance, Ruby. This given thing here is pulling the CodeDeploy agent, and you have to specify which region you're on, and then you're actually just going ahead and running this given install. So you're actually running the install part right here. And what that's going to do is that's going to actually install the agent on the EC2 instance. So again, that agent is always going to be monitoring and being notified of any deployment pushes to your machine itself. So that's pretty critical right there. And then with the Jenkins one, there's a similar startup there too, where you're basically installing the Jenkins software, the Java JDK, things of that nature, so that you can go ahead and log in and configure and start up your Jenkins server as well. So having said that, let's go ahead and just run this pipeline. So I'm going to go ahead and save these changes here, and let's go and execute it. So right here, I've already run this before. I'm going to do a release change, which means, you know, go ahead and run it again. So now if you take a look here, it's running the source one, so it's pulling everything down from the GitHub repo, and it just finished that. And now that that's succeeded, it's going to the next step, which is It's communicating to Jenkins right now, and it's running the build step, which is right here. And so the build step is basically taking the artifacts from GitHub that it gets, and it's right here from the code pipeline, and it's going to be running the rake command on it. And when it's done with that, it's going to take the output of rake and it's going to shove it through the code pipeline publisher, which ends up shoving it into this very next step, which is going to do the staging. So I am going to pause this while that works. Okay, so that build step just finished. That took a little bit of time, and now it's running the staging. So now it's actually deploying the application to our test EC2 instance. So it's actually communicating to the CodeDeploy agent on that particular instance, and it's installing the latest and greatest change. So again, in a real world situation, anytime you push changes up to your GitHub repo, this particular source stage will be alerted. It'll wake up and it'll start pulling the changes and shoving it right into this step. So now it looks like our staging set is done. So again, that's this particular URL. So ultimately, you know, if I were to make a change to that particular web page and push it back up into GitHub, you would see the new change here. So this is our test server. Now here's the really cool part. So now we're in the approval step, and if you look here, it says waiting for manual approval. So this is going to just sit and spin until until the person that you specified to receive the approval has actually said, hey, I'm okay with it. Go ahead and deploy it to production. Until then, it's not going to deploy to production. So this is a situation where it might sit in this stage for quite a while people are testing and looking at your QA server, if you will. But I'm going to go ahead and open up the email that I got from this and show you what that looks like. So no offenses, I'd rather not show my actual email address. I've kind of just boxed a little bit, but you can see these are the different emails that I get from the SNS trigger notifications. But the interesting one to see is the very last one, where it says approval needed, AWS CodePipeline Jenkins for action approval. So let me open that up. You can click on this approve or reject, and when you do that, it will take you to basically what you see right here. If you go to the pipeline, it'll take you to this given site here. Bear with me one second, this review. So it'll basically take you right here, and you can go ahead and say, I approve. Go ahead and deploy to production. Or you can reject it, in which case the pipeline just stops right there. So I'll say approve. Now that you've approved, so imagine the scenario where it may take a day or so to actually go through this step. Now you've approved, so now it's actually going to go ahead and fire off the deployment to your production server. And let's just go ahead and let that finish. And then we'll bring up the production server just to and show you that the application got deployed to that instance as well. I will pause the recording until that's finished because it may take a little bit of time. Okay, it finished. So let's go to our details. And as you can see, here's the details of our given deployment, including the events that you can see here. So you can see that it went ahead and deployed it over to our production server. It successfully finished all these steps. So how can we tell that? We can go to our EC2 management console and take our IP address and paste it in here. As you can see, here's our test server IP address. So it's 552.91.3123, and I'm going to basically replace that with our production server and run it, and there we go. So we've actually got this application deployed now to both of our instances. And again, recapping, our EC2 instances, these two here have the CodeDeploy agent running on it, and to demonstrate Jenkins and stuff, we have that installed on the other EC2 instance. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I can add to this, other than it would be a pretty typical scenario in a DevOps environment. So CodeDeploy and CodePipeline work quite beautifully together. There's also code commit, and some of the other, I've been taking some other courses and refreshers, but code commit allows you to have your own private repos, and you know, so it's based on GitHub here. So I've been kind of taken some training, and you know, I created a Wonder Widgets directory here. By the way, Thomas Hazlitt is a great instructor. I highly recommend, if you're wanting to learn more about the intricacies of AWS and stuff like that. He has some wonderful courses. But anyways, you can see this is basically a private GitHub repo. I think I've rambled on enough, so I highly recommend, if you want to learn a little bit more about AWS CodeDeploy and CodePipeline, that you go and take that tutorial, and you know, I'll put it in the notes and all that, and I hope you have a great one. Sorry about the 2 videos, and you take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye.